The focus of this DEI module is women and gender. Now, women's and gender studies are entire fields of scholarly research unto themselves. This module is narrow in scope and breadth, and hopefully will lead to more independent study. Gender intersects with all of the other groups that we are examining: race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and disability. Gender issues are extensive in both public management and public policy. In this presentation, we will start with an overview and then explore employment issues both from a public management and a public policy frame. The study of women and gender has its own language. Independently, examine the various gender-oriented glossaries available on the web and linked in this module. Among the most important concepts are these. Gender is a social construction which creates ascribed roles that women are expected to play in society. While the roles change over time, they don't change all at once. The ascribed roles lead to cultural stereotypes that can be enduring. Stereotypes form the bases for implicit biases that can lead to discrimination. Discrimination leads to disparities in outcomes in multiple dimensions, notably pay inequity. The biases and their consequences may be implicit, unconscious, and even unintended, none of which mitigates the impact. When discrimination and behaviors that objectify and marginalize women are intentional, this is referred to as sexism, a belief that women should be confined to certain roles in subordination to men. When sexism manifests itself into actual hatred or aversion to women, this is known as misogyny. Misogyny can be demonstrated not only through discrimination, but through abuse and violence. The socially constructed roles and stereotypes based on gender vary across the many different cultures that are present to varying degrees within the United States. Each requires its own analysis. In this module, we attempt to examine some cross-cutting issues related to women, knowing that some issues for a white woman are different from those for an African American woman, which are different than those for a Latina and those for Asian women. Intersectionality is re-examined in this module since the term originated for the purpose of describing the unique challenges when gender, race, and other social constructions intersect. Experience of women also differ based on economic status, educational levels, geographical region, and religion. As is readily apparent, like all the groups we will study in this course, women are far from being a homogeneous group. Gender stereotypes start at a young age and get reinforced through mass media. The film Misrepresentations explores how women are depicted in the media. From the project's website, the creators write, "In a society where media is the most persuasive force shaping cultural norms, the collective message we receive is that women's value and power lie in her youth, beauty, and sexuality, not in her capacity as a leader." These cumulative images and stories create the associations that contribute to the implicit biases that are not merely individual, but societal. The ascribed roles and stereotypes have consequences on the lives of women, girls, and their families. Gender inequality is an international issue. To operationalize inequality, the United Nations uses quantitative data across 3 dimensions: health, maternal infant mortality, and adolescent birth rate; empowerment, secondary education, and seats held in the National Congress, and labor market employment participation rate. The UN calculates a gender inequality index that can be compared across different countries. The United States ranks behind 45 other countries in the UN's analysis. This analysis, however, summarizes data for all the women within a country and does not account for disparities within different groups of women based on race, age, marital status, or education. And these, of course, are only some of the relevant dimensions related to gender inequality. Inequality for women can occur across all aspects of society. Among the most impactful is economic opportunity, which is offered through meaningful employment. In the United States, the Equal Opportunity Commission, EEOC, is charged with promoting gender equity within employment. The foundation of the EEOC's work is the Equal Pay Act of 1963 and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The EPA, quote, prohibits sex-based wage discrimination between men and women in the same establishment who perform jobs that require substantially equal skill, effort, and responsibility under similar working conditions. Title VII prohibits an employer from treating a person differently or less favorably because of sex, pregnancy, sexual orientation, and gender identity. This law also prohibits employment decisions based on stereotypes, and as the EEO notes, unfair or untrue beliefs about abilities and traits associated with gender. These protections apply even if state and local laws take a different position, which they may. Where one lives matters. Title VII also prohibits sexual harassment. The Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009 overturned a Supreme Court's decision which severely restricted the time period for filing complaints of employment discrimination under the Equal Pay Act. The adoption of these federal laws did not within themselves change the hearts, minds, and behaviors that were embedded within people and institutions for decades and centuries preceding their adoption. The discriminatory behaviors that led to the adoption of the laws and procedures do not disappear, but they reemerge, both through explicit and implicit biases and discrimination. Fighting employment discrimination through the EEOC process is long and difficult, and it can be emotionally draining. In 2020, the first year of the pandemic, almost 22,000 cases were filed with the EEOC on gender discrimination. This was the lowest number of cases in over 2 decades. The year of the highest number of cases was in 2012, with over 30,000 filed. Through its various procedures, the EEOC claims to achieve resolutions favorable to the charging party in about 1/5 of the cases. It's much smaller numbers perceived through the EEOC process, where they determine that there is a reasonable cause for action, and only about half of those are resolved through voluntary efforts. Once a woman goes through such a process and remains with her employer, how is she viewed? How is she treated? The case of Lilly Ledbetter illustrates the challenges of an EEOC case. As told on her website, Lilly Ledbetter was born in a house with no running water or electricity in the small town of Possum Trot, Alabama. She knew that she was destined for something more, and in 1979, with 2 young children at home, and over the initial objections of her husband, Charles, Lilly applied for her dream job at the Goodyear Tire Factory. Even though the only women she had seen there were secretaries in the front office where she had submitted her application, she got the job, one of the first women hired at the management level. Though she faced daily gender prejudice and sexual harassment, Lilly pressed onward, believing that eventually things would change. Until 19 years after her first day at Goodyear, Lilly received an anonymous note revealing that she was making thousands less per year than the men in her position. Devastated, she filed a sex discrimination case against Goodyear, which she won. The amount that Ledbetter won in that case was $3.8 million, but Goodyear appealed, and Goodyear won in the Supreme Court on a 5-4 decision based on a legal technicality. Ledbetter had filed her claim too late because she had learned of the disparities too late. Dissenting Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg called the majority's ruling out of tune with the realities of wage discrimination and a, quote, cramped interpretation of Title VII incompatible with the statute's broad remedial purpose, end quote. She suggested that Congress should act to correct the court's reading of Title VII. And subsequently, Congress did fix the law. 11 years after Ledbetter filed her EEOC case. 11 years later. And too late for Ledbetter to receive any back pay. You see, notwithstanding statutory prohibitions against employment discrimination, it continues, as illustrated in the Ledbetter case and multiple others. Discrimination occurs in all aspects of organizational management, restricting gender diversity at hiring, creating exclusionary cultures once women are there, and implementing inequitable practices such as unfair pay. In some cases, these practices are based on sexist ideology, and in others they are unintentional and unconscious, a result of implicit bias that shapes how people view women and their roles at work. The organization leanin.org has a short course on LinkedIn Learning about gender bias. They make available a set of scenarios on what they call bias cards, which detail the different types of biases and ways to respond to them. Effective DEI public management requires the creation of organizations that are free from bias. This requires quantitative and qualitative analysis to know what is going on within the organization. Analysis should include applicant pools, hiring rates, pay equity, benefit equity, and climate surveys to know to what extent diversity, inclusion, and equity goals are actually being met. It is an area of settled law that sexual harassment at work is prohibited, but its elimination is anything but subtle. Tarana Burke helped bring attention to the devastating impacts of sexual harassment in the Me Too movement, which she started in 2006 and which became a hashtag in 2017. The many cases that have come to light help make it real that sexual harassment is a pervasive problem in the workplace. A recent highly publicized case in the public sector is that of former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, who at one time may have been a future presidential contender. The public management of the governor's office, however, was not a model of diversity, equity, inclusion, but one of toxicity. Greta Carlson's case at Fox News demonstrates the challenge of sexual harassment claims even for a wealthy white woman of great privilege. According to the University of Chicago, 5 million people experience sexual harassment at work, 99.8% of which go unreported. Public policy will always be imperfect in stopping sexual harassment in the workplace. To do so requires strong organizational policies which impose strong consequences and a commitment to drive harassment starting at the top. When senior political leaders engage in sexual harassment themselves, it runs the risk of poisoning the entire organization.